The great hall of the Nexus station stretched for nearly a mile, its walls made of living crystal that pulsed with soft blue light, and within this magnificent chamber, representatives from over 200 species had gathered to witness something they considered rather amusing. Humanity had finally arrived. Ambassador Lyrindex of the Valori stood at the center podium, her crystalline body catching the light and scattering it into rainbows across the floor. And she watched the human delegation enter with what could only be described as condescending curiosity. The humans walked in a tight formation. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man named Captain Marcus Cole, who wore a simple military uniform decorated with modest ribbons. And behind him came scientists, diplomats, and advisors who looked around the chamber with wide eyes. "So these are the famous humans," whispered a Kethari representative to his companion, his forearms folded across his chest in a gesture of dismissal. "I expected them to be taller." Laughter rippled through the assembly, and the humans pretended not to hear it. Captain Cole approached the central platform where he was expected to make his case for humanity's admission to the Galactic Concord. And he did so with a calm dignity that seemed almost out of place among the sneering aliens. "Distinguished representatives," Cole began, his voice steady and clear, "Earth seeks peaceful membership in your alliance, and we come offering friendship, trade, and mutual cooperation." Ambassador Dex raised one crystalline hand to silence the murmuring crowd, and when she spoke, her voice rang like wind chimes in a storm. "We have studied your species, Captain Cole, and we find your history rather fascinating in a primitive sort of way." She gestured, and holographic images appeared in the air showing scenes from human history. Ancient battles, medieval warfare, the trenches of World War I, the mushroom clouds of nuclear weapons, soldiers fighting in jungles and deserts and frozen wastelands. Your kind has spent the majority of its existence engaged in what can only be described as enthusiastic self-destruction. Dex continued, and her tone carried the weight of someone explaining simple mathematics to a slow child. "You fight over patches of dirt, over invisible lines drawn on maps, over ideas that exist only in your minds." The assembly erupted in laughter. And this time, the humans definitely herded a massive Drothkai delegate, his armored body covered in ceremonial scars, leaned forward in his seat and bellowed across the chamber. "I have seen their weapons," he announced with barely concealed contempt. "They still use chemical propulsion systems for their ships, and their fastest vessels would take 3 of their years to reach the nearest star." More laughter followed, and Captain Cole simply stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression neutral. "Tell me, human," called out the Cathari representative, his voice dripping with amusement, "do you still point sticks at each other and make explosive sounds?" The chamber roared with hilarity at this comment, and even some of the more dignified species allowed themselves small smiles of superiority. Ambassador Dex raised her hand again, and the laughter slowly died down as she prepared to deliver her verdict. "The Galactic Concord has existed for over 40,000 of your years," she said, and her voice carried a weight of history that made the humans feel very small indeed. "We have witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations that had mastered faster than light travel while your ancestors were still learning to chip rocks into crude tools." She paused for effect, her crystalline form pulsing with soft light. "Your species is young, Captain Cole, terribly young, and your technology is primitive by any reasonable standard. And your military capabilities are frankly laughable when compared to even the weakest member of this assembly." A Valori aide projected statistics into the air: fleet sizes, weapon yields, territorial holdings, and every metric showed humanity at the bottom of every list by an embarrassing margin. "However," Dex continued, and there was something almost like pity in her voice, "we are not without mercy. and we recognize that every species must begin somewhere. She made a formal gesture that the humans have been coached to recognize as ceremonial acceptance. Earth will be granted provisional membership in the Galactic Concord, with all the limited rights and responsibilities that status entails. And you will be assigned to the Outer Rim territories, where you may conduct mining operations on several barren moons. Captain Cole inclined his head in what appeared to be grateful acknowledgement. But those who knew him well might have noticed the cold fire burning behind his eyes. "We thank the Concord for its generosity," he said, and his voice betrayed nothing of what he truly felt. The assembly began to disperse, the various species filtering out in small groups, while discussing trade agreements and political matters of actual importance. And the human delegation was left standing alone in the center of the great hall, a young lieutenant named Sarah. Chun moved closer to Captain Cole and spoke in a low voice that would not carry. "Sir, they treated us like we were their pets." Cole did not look at her, but his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "They did." Chun watched as the last of the alien delegates filtered out through the massive doorways, their conversation filled with casual dismissal of the newcomers from Earth. "What do we do now?" "Sir." Captain Cole finally turned to look at her, and in that moment, Chun saw something in his eyes that she had only seen once before. During the worst battle of her career, when their ship had been surrounded and all hope seemed lost, it was not anger, not exactly, but rather something colder and far more dangerous. Calculation. "We do exactly what humans have always done when we are underestimated," Cole said, and he began walking toward the exit with measured steps. "We watch, we learn, and we prepare." The human delegation spent the next 3 weeks at Nexus Station, ostensibly completing the administrative requirements for their provisional membership. But Cole had given quiet orders to every scientist and military officer in the group. They cataloged everything: weapon systems, ship designs, shield frequencies, tactical formations, communication protocols, and 1,000 other details that the aliens shared freely because they never imagined the primitive humans could possibly understand or use any of it. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the delegation's chief scientist, worked 18-hour days compiling data and sending encrypted transmissions back to Earth. And when she finally presented her findings to Cole, her hands were trembling with exhaustion and excitement. "Their technology is advanced," she admitted, "but it is also standardized and predictable. And they have not fought a real war in over 2,000 years. Cole studied her report in silence, his expression unreadable. "They fight with honor protocols," Rodriguez continued, "with formal declarations and rules of engagement designed for conflicts between civilized species who share the same basic assumptions about warfare." She paused and met Cole's eyes. "They have forgotten what war actually is, sir. And they have never faced an enemy that fights the way we do." Cole closed the report and stood up from his desk, walking to the small window that looked out at the stars. "When we return to Earth," he said, and his voice was quiet but filled with iron purpose, "we build and we wait, and when the time comes, we show them exactly what 100,000 years of human warfare has produced." The delegation departed Nexus Station 2 days later, their ships lumbering slowly toward the distant sun that humanity called home. And the Galactic Concord forgot about them almost immediately. They were, after all, just primitive humans with their laughable ships and their violent history and their pathetically short lifespans. What possible threat could they ever pose to civilizations that had ruled the stars for millennia? It was a question that the galaxy would soon answer, and the answer would shake the foundations of everything the Concord had ever believed about warfare, about survival, and about the true nature of the species from the small blue planet called Earth. 3 years passed in the quiet darkness of space And during that time, humanity did exactly what Captain Cole had promised. They watched, they learned, and they built Earth's orbital shipyards, worked around the clock, producing vessels that incorporated the best elements of alien technology with human ingenuity and ruthless practicality. And the new fleet bore little resemblance to the primitive ships that had carried the delegation to Nexus Station. But the galaxy paid no attention to the small blue planet on the outer rim, because the Galactic Concord had far more important matters to discuss. And besides, what could the humans possibly be building that would matter to anyone? The answer came screaming out of the void on a cold morning in the Galactic Standard Calendar, when long-range sensors detected something that should not have existed. The Vorath had arrived. Ambassador Lyrin Dex was in her meditation chamber when the first reports reached the Valori homeworld, and she initially dismissed them as sensor errors or perhaps some elaborate hoax, because the Vorath were supposed to be a myth, a cautionary tale told to frighten young species of the dangers that lurked in the unexplored regions of space. But the Vorath were very real, and they were very hungry. The first images showed a swarm so vast that it blocked out the stars themselves, billions of organic ships moving as one, their surfaces writhing with living tissue, their weapons pulsing with terrible biological energy. And at the center of the swarm floated the hive carriers, massive structures that served as mobile breeding grounds and command nodes for the collective consciousness. The Vorath did not communicate, did not negotiate, did not demand surrender, because they had no concept of diplomacy or mercy or anything resembling individual thought. And they had only one purpose programmed into every cell of their being: consume. They struck the Valori homeworld first. Vex watched in horror as her civilization crumbled in less than 72 hours. As the crystalline cities that had stood for 20,000 years were melted down for raw materials, as 4 billion of her people were processed into organic slurry to feed the ever-growing swarm, she escaped on one of the last ships to leave the planet. And as she looked back at her dying world, she saw something that would haunt her dreams forever. The Vorath were not just consuming her people, they were incorporating them, absorbing their genetic material and their memories and everything that made them who they were. The distress call went out to every member of the Galactic Concord, and for the first time in 2,000 years, the great powers of the galaxy mobilized for war. The combined fleet that gathered at the Meridian Belt was the largest military force in recorded history. 10,000 warships from 100 different species, their weapons representing the most advanced technology that 40,000 years of civilization had produced. Admiral Korath of the Droth Kai took command, his armored body scarred from countless ceremonial duels, and he arranged his forces with the precision and elegance that had won him fame throughout the Concord. The battle began at dawn by Galactic Standard Time, and for the first 3 hours, it seemed like the Concord might actually have a chance. The alien warships danced through the void in perfect formation, their weapons striking with surgical precision, and individual Vorath ships exploded in brilliant flashes of biological fire. But for every Vorath ship destroyed, 10 more emerged from the swarm, and the hive carriers continued their relentless advance, spawning new attack vessels faster than the Concord fleet could eliminate them. By the 6th hour, Admiral Korath was dead, his flagship torn apart by a swarm of Vorath boarding organisms that had eaten through the hull in minutes. And command passed to a Valori captain who lasted only 20 minutes before suffering the same fate. The Concord fought with honor, with courage, with all the tactical brilliance that civilized warfare demanded. And none of it mattered, because the Vorath had no honor, no fear, no concept of acceptable losses or strategic retreat. They simply consumed. By the 12th hour, the combined fleet had lost over 60% of its ships, and the survivors were in full retreat, their elegant formations shattered, their proud warriors screaming in terror as the swarm pursued them toward the Core World's ambassador. Vex was aboard a refugee transport when the emergency transmission was broadcast across all frequencies, and she helped compose the message herself, though her crystalline hands trembled with exhaustion and grief. This is a general distress call to all species capable of rendering aid. The message read, "The Vorath have breached the Meridian Belt and are advancing toward the core worlds, and the combined fleet of the Galactic Concord has been effectively destroyed, and we estimate that without immediate assistance, the remaining civilizations of the Concord will be consumed within 90 standard days." The message paused, and then continued with words that tasted like ashes in Nex's mouth. "Any species capable of rendering aid, regardless of membership status, is urged to respond. And we acknowledge that we have no right to ask for help. But we are begging nonetheless, because if the Vorath are not stopped, every sentient being in this galaxy will be consumed." The transmission was sent to every known inhabited system, including the distant outer rim where a small blue planet orbited an unremarkable yellow star on Earth. The message was received at 0347 hours Earth Standard Time, in a bunker buried deep beneath the Rocky Mountains. And the duty officer who first heard it felt his blood run cold. He immediately contacted his superior, who contacted her superior, who contacted the Joint Chiefs, who contacted the President, who authorized the single phrase that would change the course of galactic history: "Wake the Admiral, Marcus Cole." Now holding the rank of Fleet Admiral, was in his quarters when the call came, and he listened to the Concord's desperate plea with an expression that betrayed nothing of his thoughts. When the recording finished, he sat in silence for exactly 30 seconds, and then he picked up his communicator and spoke 5 words: "Total war protocol is authorized." Within minutes, alarms were sounding at every military installation on the planet, and within hours, the shipyards that had been building in secret for 3 years began disgorging their deadly cargo. The first human fleet broke orbit at 0600 hours, and Admiral Cole stood on the bridge of his flagship, the UNS Prometheus, watching the stars streak past as his ships accelerated toward the distant battlefield. His executive officer, Captain Sarah Chun, approached him with a tablet showing the latest intelligence on the Vorath swarm. "Sir, based on the Concord's data, we are outnumbered approximately 10,000 to 1. Cole did not look away from the stars. I am aware of the odds." "Captain," Chen hesitated, and then asked the question that everyone in the fleet was thinking, "Do we have a chance?" "Sir." Admiral Cole finally turned to face her, and in his eyes, she saw something that she had first glimpsed 3 years ago on Nexus Station: cold, calculated, utterly ruthless determination. "The Concord has been fighting this war the wrong way," he said, and his voice was quiet but carried absolute certainty. "They have been fighting with honor, with rules, with the assumption that their enemy thinks and feels the way they do." He turned back to the viewport, where the distant glow of the Vorath swarm was just becoming visible. "We will not make that mistake, and we will show the galaxy what happens when you wake the war instinct of a species that has been perfecting the art of destruction since the first human picked up a rock and realized it could kill." The fleet accelerated toward the swarm and aboard every ship. Human soldiers prepared for a battle that would either save the galaxy or end their species forever. They did not pray for victory. They simply checked their weapons and waited for the order to begin. The survivors of the Concord fleet had gathered at Thesan Prime, a fortress world that had never fallen in 12,000 years of recorded history, and they watched their sensors with growing despair as the Vorath swarm approached Admiral. Vexton of the Cathari had assumed command of the remaining forces, and he had arranged his battered ships in a defensive formation around the planet, knowing that this would likely be the last stand of galactic civilization. "How long until the swarm arrives?" he asked, his forearms gripping the command console. 7 hours. "Admiral," his tactical officer replied, and the fear in his voice was impossible to hide. Vexton closed his eyes and prepared to compose a final message to his family, when suddenly his sensor operator let out a cry of surprise. "Admiral, we?" Detecting unknown vessels approaching from the galactic rim, Vexton turned to the display. And what he saw made no sense at all, because the ships were moving far faster than any vessel from the outer rim should be capable of moving. And there were hundreds of them. Their designs unfamiliar, but somehow terrifying in their brutal simplicity. "Identify those ships?" he demanded. The sensor operator worked frantically at his console, and when the identification came through, his voice carried a mixture of confusion and desperate hope. "Sir, they are human." The human fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. And Admiral Cole's voice immediately crackled across the communication channels. "This is Fleet Admiral Marcus Cole of the United Nations Space Command, and we are here to assist in the defense of Thiessen Prime, and I am assuming tactical command of all allied forces effective immediately." Vexton bristled at the presumption of a species that had been mocked as primitive only 3 years ago. But before he could object, Cole continued, "All Concord vessels will fall back to a defensive perimeter around the planet and focus on protecting civilian evacuation routes, and human forces will engage the Vorath directly." "Admiral Cole," Vexton interrupted, "you cannot possibly expect your ships to stand against the swarm, and the Vorath outnumber you by an impossible margin." There was a pause, and when Cole spoke again, his voice was calm and cold. "Admiral Vexton, with respect, your forces have been fighting this enemy for 3 weeks, using tactics designed for civilized warfare against opponents who share your basic assumptions about combat." Another pause. "We do not share those assumptions, and we never have." The human fleet split into 3 groups and accelerated toward the approaching swarm, and the Concord survivors watched with a mixture of horror and fascination as the humans began to fight in ways that no civilized species had ever conceived. The first wave of human ships did not engage the Vorath directly at all, and instead they targeted the swarm's navigation arrays with precision strikes that seemed almost random until the Vorath ships began to drift off course and collide with each other. "They are blinding them," whispered a Valori tactical officer in disbelief. "They are not trying to destroy the swarm. They are trying to confuse it." The second wave was even more shocking, because these were not warships at all, but converted mining vessels packed with radioactive ore and nuclear warheads, and they flew directly into the heart of the Vorath formation without any attempt at evasion or self-preservation. The first ship struck a hive carrier and detonated with enough force to vaporize everything within 1,000 kilometers. And the human crew had made no attempt to evacuate, no attempt to escape, because they had known from the moment they launched that they were already dead. Suicide attacks. Vexton breathed, and his voice carried something close to religious terror. "They are using suicide attacks." The Concord had no word for this tactic, because no civilized species had ever conceived of using their own people as weapons, and yet the humans did it without hesitation, without ceremony, without any apparent sense that they were doing something extraordinary. Ship after ship plunged into the swarm and exploded, and each explosion tore great holes in the Vorath formation. And for the first time since the war began, the swarm faltered, but Cole was not finished. The third wave carried something far more dangerous than nuclear weapons. They carried technology that the humans had been developing in secret since their humiliation at Nexus Station. Technology designed to exploit the one weakness that the Concord had been too panicked to notice. The Vorath communicated through a quantum-entangled network that connected every member of the swarm to the collective consciousness. And this network was what allowed billions of individual organisms to act as a single unified mind. The human ships broadcast a quantum disruption field that shattered that network like glass. Ambassador Dex was watching from a refugee ship when the effect became visible, and she would later describe it as the moment she first understood what humanity truly was, the Vorath swarm, which had moved with perfect coordination for the entire war, suddenly fragmented into chaos, and individual clusters that had worked together seamlessly began to attack each other. Unable to distinguish friend from foe, unable to receive orders from the hive carriers, unable to function as anything other than confused and frightened animals, the human warships swept through the disoriented swarm like wolves through a flock of sheep, their weapons tearing through Vorath ships that had forgotten how to defend themselves. And the slaughter was so complete that even hardened Concord veterans turned away from their screens. Captain Chun stood beside Admiral Cole on the bridge of the Prometheus and watched the carnage with an expression that was impossible to read. "Sir, the Vorath are attempting to retreat." Cole's response was immediate and absolute. No quarter, no retreat, no survivors. The human fleet pursued the fleeing Vorath with relentless fury, and when the swarm tried to scatter in different directions, Cole had already anticipated the tactic and positioned ships to intercept every escape route. A Cathari commander named Threxnal was stationed aboard a human destroyer as a liaison officer, and he watched in growing horror as the humans systematically annihilated an enemy that was already beaten. "They are running," he said to the human captain beside him. "The battle is won, and you can let them go." The captain, a young woman with cold eyes and a scarred face, did not even look at him. "You do not understand, Commander, and you have never understood. And that is why your civilizations have been losing this war since it began." She pointed at the fleeing Vorath on a tactical display. "Those are not soldiers retreating from a lost battle, and they are not individuals who will return home to their families and tell stories about the terrible humans." Her voice hardened. "They are cells in a body that wants to consume every living thing in this galaxy. And if we let even one of them escape, they will learn from this battle, and they will adapt, and they will come back stronger." She turned to her weapons officer. "Target the largest concentration and fire everything we have." The Vorath remnants died screaming across frequencies that only the quantum-sensitive could hear, and their death cries echoed through the void like the wailing of damned souls. When the battle finally ended, the Concord survivors emerged from their defensive positions and surveyed the aftermath with a mixture of gratitude and existential terror. Admiral Vex then approached Cole's flagship and requested permission to come aboard. And when he was finally escorted to the bridge, he found the human admiral standing alone at the viewport, staring at the debris field that had once been the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known. "How?" Vex then asked, and his voice was barely a whisper. "How did you know to fight like this?" Cole did not turn around. "Because we have been practicing on each other for 100,000 years, he said, and his voice was tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "Every atrocity in human history taught us something, and every war made us better at killing, and every genocide showed us how to break a population." He finally turned to face the Cathari admiral. "You thought our history of violence was a sign of primitiveness, but you were wrong, because that violence was not a weakness, and it was evolution." His eyes were hollow, empty, ancient. "We are what happens when a species spends its entire existence learning how to destroy. And now you understand why we were content to be laughed at, because we knew that eventually you would need us." Vexton had no response, because there was nothing he could say that would change what he had witnessed, and nothing that would ever make him forget the terrible beauty of humanity at war. The war lasted 14 months, and by any reasonable measure, it should have lasted decades. The Vorath had consumed 17 civilizations before reaching Concord space, and their numbers had been beyond counting, their hunger without limit, their adaptability legendary among the few species that had encountered them and survived. But humanity, did not fight reasonable wars. Admiral Cole coordinated the campaign from his flagship with the cold precision of a surgeon removing a cancer, and every decision he made was designed to maximize destruction while minimizing the chance of Vorath adaptation. When the swarm tried to regroup at their breeding worlds, human ships were already there, having anticipated the retreat based on behavioral models that Earth scientists had developed during the first weeks of the war. When the Vorath attempted to split into smaller groups to avoid the quantum disruption technology, Cole deployed a network of automated weapons platforms that hunted them down one cluster at a time. When the hive mind tried to evolve new communication methods that could resist the disruption, human biologists had already developed countermeasures based on samples taken from destroyed Vorath ships. The Concorde watched in horrified fascination as humanity systematically dismantled an enemy that had seemed invincible only months before, and they began to understand that they had fundamentally misunderstood what humans were. The biological weapons came first. Human scientists had analyzed Vorath physiology with the same ruthless efficiency that their ancestors had once applied to studying plague and pestilence. And they had designed a virus that targeted the specific proteins that held Vorath cells together. The virus was deployed on 3 major breeding worlds, and within 72 hours, the Vorath populations on those planets had literally dissolved into organic soup. A Valori Ethics Council immediately condemned the weapon as a war crime, and their formal protest was delivered to Admiral Cole by Ambassador Dex herself. Cole read the protest in silence, and then he looked up at Dex with eyes that had seen too much death to care about diplomatic niceties. "Ambassador, how many of your people died when the Vorath attacked your homeworld?" Dex's crystalline form flickered with remembered pain. 4 billion. Cole nodded slowly. "And how many children were among them?" Dex did not answer, because the answer was too terrible to speak aloud. "The Vorath do not distinguish between soldiers and civilians," Cole said, and his voice was flat and emotionless. "They do not spare the young or the old or the sick, and they do not accept surrender or offer mercy, and they will continue to consume until every sentient being in this galaxy is dead." He stood up from his desk and walked to the window, where the distant glow of a burning Vorath world was visible against the stars. "Your ethics were designed for wars between civilizations that share basic assumptions about the value of life," he continued. "But this is not that kind of war. And if we fight with honor against an enemy that has none, we will lose. And losing means extinction." He turned back to face her. "I will not apologize for saving the galaxy, Ambassador, and I will not hesitate to use every weapon at my disposal. And if your council wishes to condemn me for war crimes, they are welcome to do so after the Vorath are extinct." The campaign continued with brutal efficiency. Human fleets crashed asteroids into Vorath breeding worlds, sterilizing entire planets with kinetic impacts that made nuclear weapons look like firecrackers. Human infiltration teams captured Vorath specimens and extracted their pheromone signatures, then broadcast false signals that caused entire swarm clusters to turn on each other in feeding frenzies. Human psychological warfare units developed sounds and images that triggered panic responses in Vorath organisms, and these were broadcast continuously across all frequencies in combat zones. By the 8th month of the war, the Vorath had stopped advancing, and by the 10th month, they were in full retreat. And by the 12th month, their numbers had been reduced to a fraction of what they had been at the war's beginning. The final battle took place at the Vorath origin world, a planet so ancient that it had no name in any language, only a designation in the hive mind's collective memory. Admiral Cole brought every ship in the human fleet to that world, and he surrounded it with a blockade so complete that nothing could enter or leave. And then he issued the only ultimatum of the entire war: surrender unconditionally, and submit to permanent quarantine, or face complete annihilation. The Vorath response came not in words but in action. As the remaining swarm clusters launched a desperate attack against the blockade, and Cole gave the order that would define humanity's place in galactic history: purge them all. The bombardment lasted for 3 days, and when it was over, the Vorath origin world was a lifeless cinder, and the species that had consumed 17 civilizations had been reduced to scattered remnants hiding in the darkest corners of the galaxy. The final casualty reports were staggering by any measure. Humanity had lost 340,000 soldiers, along with over 2,000 ships and countless pieces of equipment that could never be replaced. But the Vorath had lost approximately 94% of their total population, and the survivors were so scattered and traumatized that they would never again pose a threat to any spacefaring civilization. When the war was officially declared over, Admiral Cole addressed the combined fleet from the bridge of his battered flagship, and his words were broadcast to every ship in the Armada. "What we have done here will be remembered for as long as our species exists," he said, and his voice was heavy with exhaustion and something that might have been grief. "We have committed acts that civilized beings would call atrocities, and we have used weapons that decent people would call monstrous. And we have fought in ways that our enemies could never have imagined." He paused, and the silence stretched across the void. "Some will say that we have become monsters ourselves. And perhaps they're right, but monsters are what this war required. And monsters are what humanity has always been capable of becoming when our survival is at stake." Another pause. "I do not ask for your forgiveness, because I do not believe we have done anything that requires forgiveness, and I do not ask for your gratitude, because we did not fight for gratitude." His voice hardened. "We fought because an enemy threatened to consume everything we have ever loved, and we fought because no one else could. And we fought because that is what humans do when we are pushed to the edge." He straightened his shoulders and looked directly into the camera. "The war is over, and the Vorath are broken, and now we must decide what kind of species we will be in the peace that follows." He did not say what that decision should be, because he knew that it was not his to make alone, and he knew that the galaxy would be watching to see what humanity chose. The Concord survivors who had witnessed the war looked at their human allies with new eyes, and the mockery that had once filled the great halls of Nexus Station was replaced by something far more complicated. A mixture of gratitude and fear and profound uncertainty about what it meant to share a galaxy with a species capable of such terrible and beautiful destruction. Ambassador Thex approached Cole after the address, her crystalline form still bearing the cracks and scars from the attack on her homeworld. And she asked the question that everyone was thinking: what happens now? "Admiral," Cole looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time since the war began, something like vulnerability flickered across his face. "Now we go home," he said, "and we try to remember how to be human again." It was not an answer that satisfied anyone, but it was the only answer he had, and it would have to be enough for now. 5 years after the end of the Vorath War, the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. And at the center of that change stood a species that had once been dismissed as primitive children playing with sticks. The Galactic Concord still existed, but its power structures had been fundamentally altered. And the species that had once looked down on humanity now sought their counsel on matters of security. Strategy and Survival Earth held a permanent seat on the Security Council, not because humans had demanded it, but because no other species dared to suggest otherwise. And human military advisors were embedded with every major fleet in the Concord, their expertise in warfare now considered essential rather than. Barbaric Ambassador Lyrian Dex had become one of humanity's closest allies. A crystalline form rebuilt with human-designed medical technology that had saved her life after the war. And she often served as a bridge between the proud civilizations of the core worlds and the newcomers from the outer rim. But the change that mattered most was not political or military, and it was something that only those who knew humanity well could truly appreciate. Admiral Marcus Cole had retired from active service 3 months after the war ended, and he had returned to Earth to live in a small farmhouse in Montana, where the mountains reminded him of a time before he had learned to kill on an industrial scale. He never gave interviews, never attended commemorations, never spoke publicly about the campaign that had saved galactic civilization. And when reporters tried to find him, they discovered that the most feared military commander in the galaxy spent his days growing vegetables and reading ancient books about philosophy. Captain Sarah Chun visited him once, 6 months after his retirement, and she found him sitting on his porch watching the sunset with a cup of tea in his hands. "The Concord wants to give you a medal," she said. "Actually, they want to give you about 40 medals, and they are getting increasingly frustrated that you will not accept any of them." Cole smiled, but it was a tired smile that did not reach his eyes. "I did not fight for medals, Captain, and accepting them would suggest that what we did was something to celebrate." Chun sat down beside him and watched the sun sink below the mountains. "Was it not something to celebrate?" "Sir, because from where I am standing, we saved the galaxy." Cole was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "We also killed approximately 8 billion sentient beings, Captain, and yes, they were monsters who wanted to consume everything we loved. But they were still alive, and we ended them." He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much. "That is not something I can celebrate, even if it was necessary. And I hope I never become the kind of person who could." The Prometheus Doctrine was established the following year, a binding agreement ratified by Earth's government and eventually adopted by the entire Concord. The doctrine stated that humanity's war-fighting capabilities would only be deployed in defense of sentient life. Never for conquest, never for resources, never for political advantage, and never for pride. Some humans argued against the restriction, claiming that Earth had earned the right to expand its influence through force if it chose to do so. And some aliens doubted that any species could truly restrain itself after tasting the kind of power that humanity had demonstrated. But the doctrine was enforced with the same ruthless efficiency that humanity applied to everything else. And the few who tested its limits discovered that humans were just as willing to punish their own as they were to destroy external threats. Ambassador Dex came to Earth for the 5th anniversary of the war's end, and she sought out a human philosopher named Dr. Maya Okonkwo, who had become famous for her writings on the nature of human violence. They met in a garden in Geneva, where flowers from 100 worlds bloomed in careful arrangements that spoke of peace and renewal. "I have a question that I have been afraid to ask since the war ended," Dex said, her crystalline form catching the afternoon light. Okonkwo smiled gently. "Please, ask whatever you wish." Dex hesitated, and then spoke the words that had haunted her for 5 years. "Why did you choose restraint?" "Because you could have conquered the galaxy after the Varith War, and no one would have been able to stop you. And yet you chose to limit yourselves instead." Dr. Okonkwo was quiet for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice was thoughtful and careful. "Because we know what we are, Ambassador, and we have seen what happens when our instincts go unchecked." She gestured at the garden around them. The Vorith were monsters, but they were simple monsters, and they consumed because consumption was all they knew, and they had no choice in the matter. Her expression grew more serious. "Humans are complicated monsters, Ambassador, and we can choose. And that is both our greatest strength and our greatest danger." She met Dex's eyes directly. "We have spent our entire existence learning how to destroy, and we have become very good at it. perhaps better than any species in the history of this galaxy. But we have also learned something that the Vorath never could. Dex leaned forward. What is that? We have learned that the ability to destroy is not the same as the right to destroy, Dr. Okonkwo said. And that true strength lies not in what you can do, but in what you choose not to do. She smiled. But there was something ancient and sad in her eyes. The most dangerous weapon in the universe is not a fleet or a bomb or a biological agent that can dissolve entire populations. And the most dangerous weapon in the universe is a species that knows exactly how terrible it can be, and decides, every single day, to be better. Dex considered this for a long time, and finally she asked one more question. Do you believe that humanity will keep its promise? Because the doctrine is only words, and words can be broken. Dr. Okonkwo stood up and looked at the sky, where human ships passed overhead on their way to distant stars. I do not know, Ambassador, because I cannot see the future, and I cannot promise that every human will always make the right choice. She turned back to face the Valori ambassador. But I can tell you this. We have been given a gift that few species ever receive. And that gift is the knowledge of our own capacity for both creation and destruction. And we have chosen to use that knowledge wisely. Her voice hardened with conviction. And as long as there are humans who remember what we did in the war, and what we could do if we ever forgot our promise, there will be humans who fight to keep that promise alive. The galaxy continued to watch humanity in the years that followed, and they watched with a mixture of respect and hope and quiet, persistent caution. The laughter that had once filled the halls of Nexus Station was gone forever, replaced by something far more complicated, an acknowledgement that the universe was stranger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined, and that the small blue planet called Earth had produced something truly remarkable, not just warriors, though humans were certainly that, not just scientists, though their innovations had changed the face of warfare, not just diplomats, though their influence now reached every corner of the Concord. Humanity had produced was something rarer, a species that had looked into the darkest parts of its own nature, and had seen the monster that lived there, and had chosen to chain that monster rather than let it loose. Whether that chain would hold forever, no one could say, but for now, it was enough, and no one laughed at Earth anymore. The end.